So my background is in filmmaking, but I'm going to be talking today about storytelling because that's ultimately what filmmaking is about at its core, and it's also what entrepreneurs need to think about, at least to some extent, in terms of defining their differentials and what they actually are and what they actually do in the world. So marketing as an extension of that. So I really appreciated Tim's talk as well, because we cover similar topics, but from a different angle. So when you're telling a story, whether it's cinematic or verbal or in branding or anything of that sort, by definition, you're saying one thing and not saying everything else. So you have to decide carefully what that thing is and then vigilantly guard against saying anything else, because you're going to just muddy the waters of your message if you're trying to say more than just that thing you're trying to say. So the controlling idea is what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is a little practical tool that we apply to any branding issues, branding campaigns that we go into, as well as the featured documentaries that we do for entertainment. It comes from this guy, Robert McKee, who wrote this book, Story, back in 1997. And you actually have seen Brian Cox portray him in the movie Adaptation, if you ever saw this. But he's kind of seen as a screenwriting guru. But a lot of his topics, a lot of the tools that he's given to screenwriters and television writers over the time can be easily applied to any kind of story you're telling. And one of the central metaphors he uses is this idea of sculpting an elephant. If you think about somebody who's sculpting an elephant, what they're doing isn't actually sculpting an elephant. They're removing everything that isn't the elephant. And that's a really helpful tool to think about, because when you're trying to tell a story, you need to remove everything that isn't that story. So you have to really carefully define a very simple, brief definition. This up at the top, primary value at stake is either achieved or not achieved, plus or minus, because the main character performs a decisive action. That is going to stay up there for the remainder of my talk, so write it down if you want it. But I'm going to go into each piece, the primary value at stake. It's always a continuum. It's a yin and a yang. So it's love versus hate, freedom versus slavery, being, becoming, safety, danger, faith, nihilism. It's a binary that you're somewhere between. So you'd say that love is achieved, or freedom is achieved, or success is achieved. The character is in cinema. It's your main character in your story, or it can be a sub character in a B plot if you're just trying to identify that in a micro sense. But in branding, it's often going to be the customer is going to be the most effective thing, but it's also potentially the company itself, depending on the story you're telling. And the decisive action is whatever actual action in the world, whatever behavior is performed that achieves said value at the front. So it is not just about being a good person or something like that. It's something specific. So in the Matrix, Neo sacrifices himself. That's his decisive actions, what defines him. So the controlling idea can differentiate between a whole bunch of characters in entertainment that perform the same job title. These are 4 different detectives in movies and TV that you may recognize from different shows and movies. They're all detectives. Even the dude is a detective in that story, but they're very different characters. And the way you know that is because of how they behave. So to give an example of 2 other detectives, Sherlock Holmes and Dirty Harry, how do we know they're different? If you were writing a Sherlock Holmes story or writing a Dirty Harry story, how would you know to write them? How do they behave differently from one another? They do the same thing. They both go after justice. So if justice is your primary value at stake, the competing controlling ideas for these 2 characters would be justice is achieved because Sherlock Holmes is smarter than the criminal. For Dirty Harry, it'd be justice is achieved because Dirty Harry is more brutal than the criminal. Right? So, and these are just examples, but once you crystallize it like that, you know how you would write those. You know what you wouldn't do. You start to define the elephant. You start to know what to remove. Andrew Stanton is actually a director at Pixar, and one of his best ways of framing this is a story is a well-organized absence of information. Stories are defined by what they don't say as much as what they do say. So if you're writing Sherlock Holmes, you know it's not appropriate to have him in one scene pull out a .357 Magnum and shoot the bad guy. Likewise, if you're writing the new Dirty Harry movie, you know it's not right for him to suddenly be at a board doing what I'm doing and teaching somebody something, or busting out a magnifying glass and finding a clue. It's not in line with his character. It'll annoy the audience. They'll feel like it didn't work, and it'll reject the audience from following you further. It's the same thing in branding, right? I'm saying the same stuff. It's just a different industry. So, in screenwriting, we have to know our characters like this. In business, we have to know our brand. We also have to know our audiences, but for the sake of this conversation, I'll keep it to brand. But you can apply the exact same exercises to kind of identify and differentiate some of this stuff. These are 3 separate building contractors here in Wisconsin. We do a lot of work with construction in our particular company. You can't tell by their services which one's which. They all would say they do any of these or a version of these. If you were to ask company 2 whether they do remodeling, they would say yes. So like you can't tell them apart. It's not, your services don't define you. So let's take 2 tech companies, Apple and Microsoft. Productivity could be your story you're telling, some story about that value. So productivity is increased because Apple is easier to use than the alternatives would be a story you could tell. Or productivity is increased because Windows is more versatile and universal than the alternatives. These are 2 stories you could tell. How about at the product level rather than the company? Productivity is increased because the MacBook Pro emphasizes graphics performance more than the alternatives. Or you could tell a story about how peace of mind is achieved because the MacBook Pro protects my data better, which is, I think, is the story they're telling right now with all their security ads. You can tell any story you want. You just have to keep to that once you decide on what it is to make it coherent. So this is another example from another company that talks about the controlling idea a lot. Imagine a recipe service. Life's more fun when you can improvise and let go of fear of failing. Suddenly you can make these columns. What's encouraged? What's not encouraged? What's some more possibilities? You start to know what your character is of the brand, and you start to be able to translate that into actionable behavior so you can embody a clear and coherent story. And that's what the controlling idea is all about. So it's very, very practical about something that's very nebulous. And we all think we know storytelling in that sense. So take that equation and tell your stories as best you can. So thank you so much.